get into the minutiae of what I'm going to say. I'm not from a farming background myself. I'm an Edinburgh girl, born and bred, but my previous career was working in politics, and that's what I've always had an interest in. So it was from that side of things that I joined the union 4 years ago. But I really have built up such a passion for this industry, and it's certainly the most interesting time ever to be working in an industry like farming now, as we grapple with Brexit and all the joys that brings. So a bit about NFU Scotland and the organisation I'm here to represent this evening. We have over 8,500 members across the country. They're ranging from farms, big and small, to crofts, to growers, and a growing base of professional organisations as well. We are been running for 105 years. We're made up of 9 regions and 78 branches, right across the different agricultural commodities. We are independent of, but work very closely with our sister unions in England, Wales and Ulster. So we will quite often adopt a common position on many, many issues, but there are issues as well where we do take a differing stance. So I am one of 30 staff that is employed by the union. Our role is to promote policy that is decided by our democratic decision-making processes via our committee and working group structures. We are apolitical by statute, but politics is clearly at the heart of absolutely everything that we do as a lobbying organisation. As political affairs manager, my role is to work with parliamentarians and try and promote our members' interests to those sat in Holyrood and Westminster and Brussels, try and keep rural issues at the heart of the political agenda and to make sure that farmers' voices are always heard. So on that apolitical standpoint, it is pertinent to acknowledge the stance that we took in the European referendum. As we are apolitical, we always will have to sit on the fence on matters of political decision-making, general elections and independence referendums. We took a very neutral line on all of that. However, in the case of the European referendum, it was clearly a once-in-a-lifetime decision that people were being asked to make. And we commissioned research along with our sister unions at the time to assess the various different scenarios if we were to leave the EU as opposed to staying within. And that analysis concluded that the best business scenario for Scottish and UK farmers would be to remain within the EU. So in this one issue, we did come off the fence and we said to our members, we should remain in just purely on a business case. We didn't take a campaigning role, and nor did we promote a Remain vote to our members. It was more just a way of giving them all of the facts. But anyway, I'll address more of that later on. So what does Scottish agriculture look like? Here's just a snapshot. The answer is extremely diverse. Scotland produces everything from soft fruit and veg, a lot of it here in this part of the world actually, cereals from malting and feeding, milk, beef and lamb, pigs and poultry, and the list goes on. We operate across intensive and extensive grazing systems. They're equally variable by farm size and by farm type. Therefore, there's different sectors and businesses all throughout Scotland and Scottish agriculture that will want and need different outcomes from the Brexit situation. And that cuts across various different issues on trade, labour, support, regulation, land tenure, and so on. Scottish farmers and crofters generate outputs worth over 3 billion per year, and we sustain about 65,000 full-time jobs in the industry alone, just in agriculture, but about 360,000 jobs in the wider downstream food and drinks and hospitality industries. And for every £1 of public support that goes into agriculture, Scottish farmers and crofters will spend some £5.30. So just quickly, if you'll just entertain me for a few more minutes just on what Scottish agriculture looks like. We have a lot of this. I'm sure that'll look quite familiar to some of you. Vast hilly landscapes that are mainly only really suitable for extensive grazing systems, and 85% of Scotland is designated as a less favoured area, and only 15% as improved ground. We have much less of this. That's what you do call your improved ground for arable farming. But it's very productive. What we do have, we are very productive with. The arable sector here underpins the booming Scotch whisky industry, which is the jewel in Scotland's crown, and provides feed for our world-class Scotch beef and lamb sectors. So we have very productive farms and regions, but relatively lower productivity as a comparison compared to the rest of the UK, due to various different geographical challenges, which I will touch on later. And we're not averse to this. Biodiversity rich here in Scotland, so you'll often see intensive agriculture sitting side by side along environmental activities as well. So I've outlined that prior to the referendum, NFU Scotland and the other UK farming unions did come off the fence and we supported a Remain vote, but that was purely based upon the business case. On a Friday, the 24th of June 2016, that day came as quite a shock to us all. It coincided with the second day of the Royal Highland Show, which is one of the biggest events in the agriculture calendar. Lots of people were in disbelief. I was in disbelief. I had a lot of people coming to me saying, what's going to happen now? What are we going to do? Kind of needed the weekend to recover and gather our thoughts. But by Monday, 27th of June, we had sort of resigned ourselves to the fact that our job was to deal with the political realities and to try and keep our members' interests at the forefront. So as much as this was not the outcome that we prepared for nor expected, we had to try and stay on the front foot and try and push our members' interests as hard as we could with governments. So by the Monday, at the end of June 2016, we had published a list of 10 key priority areas, and those sort of distilled down into 4 key areas that still remain very pertinent to this day, and that is on trade, labour, agricultural support and regulation. These 4 key priorities have not changed one bit since the outcome of the referendum and that day in June 2016. However, clearly the political situation has now solidified somewhat, and we now know much more about the government's negotiating priorities and how they're being received in Europe. So I've spent some time talking about what Scottish agriculture looks like, and the reality is that in those pictures that I showed you earlier, the skies are a bit too blue, so I don't want to be misleading. Scottish agriculture is challenged in terms of climate, geographically, and in terms of farm business income. So I don't know if you can see the graph very clearly there, but our industry, as many of you will know, is supported directly in terms of income support by the Common Agricultural Policy and indirectly by various different government policies and initiatives that assist with investment and management. Alongside rising input costs and unfair food chains and markets, it does conspire to make agricultural support ever more important to Scottish farmers. In 2016, 66% of agricultural incomes were made up of support, and this is a long-standing trend. And as you can see in the graph here, the profile of Scottish agriculture means that this is not an entirely uniform picture, but as I outlined, we have huge variances depending to farm enterprises, farm size, farm type, and so on. So clearly, as you can see here, we are challenged, which means that the stakes are very high in the Brexit negotiations. However, there are opportunities. If the negotiations are done well, then there will be opportunities. The food and drink industry in Scotland is fantastic. It's something which we should all be extremely proud of. It delivers more than 14 billion back to the Scottish economy and is now the biggest industry that we have here in Scotland. We have ambitions now to double the size of the food and drinks industry to 30 billion by 2030, and that is well within our reach, but only if we do well in securing favourable trade deals. That means we can grow our productivity and Scotland's brands abroad. As the custodians of the countryside, Scottish farmers and crofters are key in underpinning tourism and hospitality, which are major economies that we have here in Scotland. And the fact keeping animals in the land and people on that land is absolutely vital to maintaining the managed landscapes and the socioeconomics that will keep those visitors coming to Scotland. These landscapes are our USP. For high value produce and for tourism. So I'm conscious of the time, I will use the rest of my time to briefly, I hope, outline what our key priorities are and trying to give as much insight as I can as to how this is being received in the work that we're doing with the EU Brexit negotiators. As I outlined, the key priorities for NFU Scotland focus on trade, labour and agricultural support. So firstly, to touch on trade. As we are leaving the single market, our key priority is that we ensure as frictionless and as barrier-free trade with the EU as we possibly can, where provenance and high standards of production are protected. The free trade agreement, as was mentioned in Susanna's opening remarks there, it must take account for different sectors of the industry, and it does seem like an awful lot of work will need to be done to return something that looks very similar to what we have at the current time. But anyway, there you go. We are very, very concerned about the developing narrative around a no-deal Brexit, where the UK could revert to unilateral liberalisation of tariffs, or indeed the alternative scenario where we would revert to World Trade Organisation tariffs. Either of these scenarios would expose Scottish agriculture to an extreme level, to either extremely high trading tariffs that would just be unsustainable, or cheap food imports coming in from foreign countries where produce is not made to the same exacting standards, and this would be hugely damaging. So, safeguarding provenance, high production standards must be key. Secondly, access to skilled and competent labour. Non-UK labour is hugely valuable to Scottish and UK agriculture. We employ non-UK nationals in jobs from the fields to the fork, ranging from highly skilled herdsmen in the dairy sector who are employed on a permanent basis, to more transient seasonal posts for people moving up and down the country to pick fruit and veg, moving with harvests. We also have major employment of EU nationals in the food chain. We employ them as vets, as abattoir workers, as hauliers. They are absolutely essential to the functioning of UK-wide food and drink and agriculture. And as the domestic workforce doesn't display a preference to work in this type of work, we need to retain access to workers from overseas. And we need to have a sensible approach to controlled migration, as it's being called by the government. Because without this, our industry probably would grind to a halt. We feel there's no need to reinvent the wheel when it comes to designing a new immigration system. A lot of these things have been done before. We've had a seasonal agricultural workers scheme that worked very well to bring people over to the UK to work for up to 10 months, moving with the harvests, and various other measures as well that we are highlighting to government. But we need to have the solutions now, and we need to be having a sensible discussion about it now. So that means access to workers from outside the UK for employment on farm and off farm, in seasonal and permanent, and in skilled and what the government would call unskilled. We prefer to use the word competent. In these positions, we need to retain those people. Okay. The final issue on agricultural support is arguably the most complex, because when we leave the EU, we will be leaving the Common Agricultural Policy, which I'll refer to as the CAP, and we will need something to replace that funding and support. So if we get the trade and the labour and the regulatory issues right, I don't want to take too much for granted, but if we get those right, there does exist a major opportunity to review and redraw the system of agricultural support that moves away from an arbitrary payment just for the pleasure of occupying some land. At NFU Scotland, we are absolutely adamant that we direct any new funding and a policy to an action-based system that genuinely rewards agricultural activity, that is productive and also delivers for the environment. But it will be important, as I outlined earlier, that we do have a cushion for financial stability in the short to medium term, particularly as the transition to any new free trading agreements with the EU or internationally could be quite bumpy. And obviously, these are no easy things to address, and it will take time. And it will be impacted by the length of time that the trade deals do take to negotiate. There has been much debate in the press, particularly recently, and in the political sphere, about where the powers to develop this policy will lie, and our position is extremely clear on this. Since 1999, agricultural policy has sat within the Scottish Parliament. It's been devolved, and this has worked very well for our members, we would say. Lifting the CAP into UK law is not simple because it's vastly bureaucratic, it's been Europeanised, it's devolved, it's tied up in regulation and money, which doesn't make it easy, particularly because the application of the CAP hasn't been entirely uniform across the UK when it's been brought back here. A good way of thinking about it is that we have been operating on an uneven playing field but playing the same rules of the game, purely due to the CAP's different applications across the 4 parts of the UK. So upon Brexit, what we want to see is a new system that properly targets funding and policy to systems that will work for Scottish farming and in all of its uniqueness and the anomalies like those that I outlined earlier in the presentation. This will mean operating to a commonly agreed regulatory framework across the UK, but with the policy entirely devolved to the Scottish Parliament so that they can deliver the things that we need within the industry. We've been very clear since the outset that a DEFRA-centric, one-size-fits-all will not work for Scottish farming, and nor will it work for English, Welsh or Northern Irish farming either. We need the tools in the toolbox here in Scotland to support Scotland's less favoured areas, for example. This is a major area of emphasis for us because 85% of our land is less favoured area compared to 15% in England. So in other parts of the UK, the emphasis will be elsewhere, but it's important that we have the policy discretion to support these measures. So that will be a commonly agreed regulatory framework and a fair financial settlement with devolved delivery that's targeted at active agriculture, which is both productive and benefits the environment. So where do we go from here? I've given a very quick tour of our key priorities, and it is very difficult to try and distill them down into just a 15 or 20 minute speech, but hopefully I've given them all justice. Where do we go from here? After day one, after the referendum, we have purely focused on engaging our own membership to make sure that we properly and effectively reflect their priorities and principles. The political dogma and arguments between the various different actors has created a bit of a void, and we've seen it as our role to try and fill that void with reasonable and sensible proposals on how we move forward from the situation that we're in. On the year anniversary of the referendum result, we launched the change document, which is up here, a discussion document that we sent out to all of our members, and it tried to set out a direction of travel for future agricultural policy that was based upon a delivery model which tries to return a fairer supply chain, developing and investing in our people, and supporting farmers and crofters through a transition to the bright new future of whatever trade deals we do end up with. We are now in the process, we just took this document out to our regions at the end of last year and held a very successful roadshow, had fantastic engagement from our members. So we're just in the process of drawing up a much more detailed policy position paper on the various different measures that we would want to work with UK and Scottish governments to develop a new agricultural policy for Scotland post-Brexit. We have, as much as we've taken the lead with members, we have also massively ramped up our political engagement, which means that I have the joy of being in London at least once or twice a month these days, and we're in constant dialogue with the Scottish Government as well to ensure that they're very clear about our position. Everybody is looking for answers. This is a completely unprecedented situation that we're in, so we see it as important that everybody works together to try and arrive at a suitable point. But we also need to engage with the public and our consumers, the consumers that our members work to put food on the tables of. We're very keen to hear about how our industry is perceived, and we're looking for the public's support in achieving our vision for the future as well. So that's why I'm very pleased to be here today to try and set out this position and vision and hear your views, and I'll be keen to take any questions that you might have. So thank you for your time.
This is a photograph of the farm that it's obviously not the farm, but it's taken on the farm where I was brought up. And I kind of like it because it sort of almost looked as if the sheep are growing on trees, which is just entertaining. Let me just give you a wee map of where I'm going. I'm going to say some introductory things, quite a lot of them about myself, just to kind of situate where I'm coming from. Then I'm going to say a couple of wee things about Brexit, then I'm going to say a couple of wee things about farming, and then I'm going to say some things about Brexit and farming, particularly in relation to farming around here. And you'll see that, there's a certain amount of overlap with some of the things that Clare has been saying, but when hers is sort of professional, mine is just rank amateurish. Okay, My maternal grandfather was a tenant dairy farmer. My paternal grandfather was a tenant sheep farmer. When my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, died at a relatively young age in 1941, his wife and 9 children were turfed out of their tenanted farm. Thankfully, they'd actually worked quite hard and they actually had enough money to buy a sheep farm. At that time, in the 1940s, you could get them for about 6pence. Very cheap. And the family were subsequently able to buy a second sheep farm, and that's the one I was brought up on. Nowadays, my brother owns this farm, and this is my younger brother, me, my sister, and my younger brother. And my sister and I have been given a few shares. My mum died last year, from my mum. So essentially, my brother is worth 50 times what I'm worth, and 50 times what my sister is worth. When you look at the figures involved. And this is something that makes me very angry, and I'm sort of campaigning against the discrimination that I see there. And there are a lot of issues about women, land, access to land, and so on. Anyway, I'm chucking that in, and I'm going to sort of park it. But I want you to know one of the things that sort of fires me up in relation to land and farming. There are a few other things I should confess to while I'm in confessional mode. I live on a farm. Most of my relatives are in farming in one way or another, of my generation, that is. I'm a feminist, and I have been for about 50 years. I'm a member of the SNP. Although I'm not speaking in any way on behalf of the SNP tonight. And I voted Remain. Although, strictly speaking, I didn't vote Remain specifically for agricultural reasons. I had other reasons that made me want to vote for Remain. Let me move on slightly. Oh, I forgot to say that when I'm not writing, campaigning, researching, and getting up the nose of people who think that women shouldn't have access to land, one of the things I do is I run a stall selling agricultural produce, and this is at Perth Farmers Market. Well, if you may recognise the Bank of Scotland in the background. Okay. Let's go on to the real meat. Brexit. Lots of exclamation marks. I did a tiny bit of canvassing before I came to find out what people in my agricultural world thought about Brexit. First person I spoke to said they, and by they he meant everybody, Brexiteers, Remainers, the lot, are a shower of self-serving, and he used a word beginning with C, which I can't use because I'm a feminist, but you get the picture. The second person I asked was a little bit more well-read, you could say, and he took the view that nobody knows what's going on with Brexit. And if anybody tells you that they know what's going on with Brexit, they're lying, not to take them seriously. So Brexit, huge unknown, ridiculous unknown. Let's talk about farming briefly. I've got pictures like Clare had, only she had them all together. I'm going to string them out and make you look at lots of pictures of farming, and particularly farming in this area. So, what is farming like in Scotland? Farming produces 1% of economic output in Scotland, which always astonishes me, because you kind of think, surely it's more than that. there's an awful lot of farming seems to be going on, and that's possibly because 73% of land in Scotland is designated as agricultural holdings. So that's an awful lot of land producing 1% of economic output, which is not to say that farming isn't crucial, because we'd all not do very well if we didn't have farms making lots of our food. I'll give you another one of these. So one of the important things about farming, which Clare has touched on, is the huge variety of farming options. And farming kind of divides across two axes. One is the size, and one is what type of farming is going on. So on the one hand, there are huge differences between enormous commercial farming operations, which sometimes can look a bit like military-industrial complexes, and at the other extreme, small holdings and crofts that are very small and may not even sustain one person's livelihood, and everything in between, many variations in size. And then you've got what people are making on farms, or producing on farms, or growing on farms, principally decided by the kind of land that they're operating with. So in the kind of more fertile areas of the Strathmore Valley, for example, which is I live on the edge of, we have cereal, we have cattle, we have fruit, vegetables, and so on. In the more upland areas of Perthshire, we're looking at sheep, cattle, and some cereal, and the ubiquitous turnip, which you can just about grow anywhere. Okay, let me then go on to the particular Brexit issues. So, how is Brexit affecting farming? So the first thing is to do with exports and imports. How is Brexit? So far, Brexit is making exports easier because the pound is in the pits. Technically, it's actually started to climb up a little bit in the last couple of weeks. But there's your Brexit vote. Well, it dropped dramatically, and it's kind of been dropping ever since. So, of course, it makes it easier to sell your produce abroad. Bit of a shame if you have to import items, which some farmers do. For example, if you're growing fruit, you invariably import some of the fruit stock from European countries. So you're going to be paying more for that. Exporters may be doing reasonably well because of the crap pound, but is that any way to run an economy? Is that anything? It's not something you want to be happening. You don't want your pound to be not doing well at all. So that's the first issue. Around the people that I work with in agriculture, there's actually not that much exporting going on. And that's principally because in the UK we eat most of what we're producing. We're a net importer of many agricultural products. But exporting is something that we would want to look at as something that would allow us to grow the economy and grow farming. So that's a particular concern. Claire's already talked about common agricultural policy, farming subsidies, single farm payments. Michael Gove, Fergus Ewing, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, slipper farmers. These are some of the issues. One of the things that you need to work with in relation to common agricultural policy is the extent to which it's been an extremely controversial system ever since it was set up. It started being controversial because production was paid for and people produced butter mountains and wine lakes. It became a different sort of controversial when slipper farmers were able to stay at home, not do farming, collect huge amounts of money and rage against other benefit cheats. It's a big issue. Nowadays, as Clare pointed out, it's linked to activity. You do have to be doing farming activity. However, pinpointing exactly what constitutes activity is something that is proved a little intractable, a little difficult. I've listed Michael Gove up there because of his recent amazing conversion to green policies, because all the noises are that in the future you're only going to get your agricultural subsidy if you are making sure that you're meeting green targets, and that's going to be a sort of central plank of that. I also mentioned Pillar 2, which is worth saying something about. About 40% of EU, currently, about 40% of the EU budget goes to farmers. It was about 70% when, about the 70s, yeah, in the 70s. But an increasing proportion of money is going into Pillar 2, and Pillar 2 is money that doesn't go direct to farmers, but is about rural development, and it has three prongs to do with community, to do with development in agriculture, and to do with what's the other one? Can't remember. Sustainability. Yeah, you know, there is a push there to try and ensure that EU money is doing things that are progressive, that contribute towards sustainability, contribute towards rural development, and contribute towards making an environment that's actually decent for rural dwellers, and encouraging more and more of those to go in. Migrant labour is this is the really big one. Claire's already touched on it. What I would like to say about it is that if we do not have migrant labour coming into the country, agriculture will just about grind to a halt. Most of us know that people who come into the country to work in farms, or the kind of wide perception is that people come in the summer to pick berries, and they do. And actually, most of them come to Angus and Perthshire, so we're hugely dependent on them in this area. There are huge numbers of migrant workers who come into agriculture who come and stay. Some who come and, for example, marry Scots and carry on staying here, and some who come and stay for many months and go back to the country that they've come from, and then come back again, and you know they kind of come for long periods, and they're kind of semi-permanent residents. Most are relatively low skilled, but the important point that Clare was making about things like abattoirs, massively run by, the vets, for example, are very often Eastern European migrants who are highly qualified, and it's been argued that these jobs could be taken over by Indigenous workers. Not going to happen. They're not there. the handfuls of workers who might be drafted into agriculture, some of them aren't going to do it, some of them couldn't do it. The chances of us being able to replace the huge numbers of migrant workers that we rely on with indigenous workers is just zero. It's rubbish. You might be able to replace, a few here and there, but on the whole, it's a disaster. So most farmers, or the ones that I'm in contact with, seem to think that something like the seasonal agricultural workers scheme that was in place previously is likely to come back again. I actually find it quite ironic that the one thing that is, fueling for some people, not all, for some people, fueling Brexit, i.e. getting rid of migrants, is the one thing that's actually going to destroy us faster than anything else if Brexit succeeds. And I say that in relation to this area where we're so reliant on migrant workers, and Scotland as a whole, but it's true for England too. Many of their systems will collapse if they don't have migrant workers. Then, sort of fourth area is, what's my time like?
You've got like 5 minutes.
Okay, cool. There's labelling and provenance. There's a big campaign going on at the moment to try and ensure that Scottish produce is labelled as Scottish. There we go. This is my jam. And there's an equally, it appears, insidious campaign going on to try and stick Union Jacks on everything. I'm an SNP person, I can say that. But one of the things that the European Union has been quite good for is sustaining and supporting the provenance and branding of Scottish goods. Talked about the whisky business. I think it's increased its exports by something like 550% in recent years, which is just astonishing. It's fantastic. But one of the things that we might want to consider is that not all of the malting barley that's going into making whisky is Scottish. And that's a tragedy, and it shouldn't be happening. And that's one of the things that, the EU would protect. And then there's the issue of regulations. Got all the standard stories about bendy bananas and wonky cucumbers and so on and so forth. And my impression from talking to my farming friends is that most of them recognise, first of all, that almost all of the regulations that we have that have come via the EU, we would have in any case. And most of them will have to stay. And most of them are a good thing. You've got all the campaigns for, the awful health and safety and, misshapen vegetables and so on and so forth, which have had such an impact on, otherwise sensible people. So much of this stuff is you do want health and safety, or most of it. Sometimes it might be applied in odd ways. If we didn't have health and safety, we would still be bumping off 5,000 workers a year, which is really not a civilised way to proceed. That was the malt whiskey. Have a drink from me. And my last few slides are just kind of nice slides for your entertainment. So what I realise is I actually need my glasses. I will just be 2 minutes. Because when I started the talk at the beginning and said, what I said about women and land and so on, one of the points I wanted to make was that, not everything is rosy in farming before Brexit. Not everything was rosy in farming before we joined the European Union, and so not everything can be blamed on either the European Union or Brexit. So farming's got a lot of things it needs to actually think about other than Brexit. Land ownership, management and access, big deal. Land use and sustainability, huge issue. Changing demands in food and drink, healthy eating, organic produce, vegetarianism and veganism, all not huge at the moment, but creeping forward in all sorts of ways. Huge issues to do with animal welfare. Issues to do with the natural environment, such as loss of habitat for endangered species. Questions about economic viability of farming and the extent to which farmers are diversifying activity into such areas as tourism, forestry, energy. A couple of things that Clare was pointing out. There are social issues for farmers to consider, such as their relation to and impact upon the communities that they are part of. And over and above these specific issues, there's also a large cynical view, and I'm coming quickly to an end. This is a notion that I'm having at the moment, which is bound to be terribly controversial. But the idea that Brexit is one enormous distraction. What would we be talking about if we weren't talking about Brexit? I mean, we get up every day and there's another episode of the sort of circus and the soap that's going on in Westminster. But, it's allowing us not to talk about austerity. It's allowing us not to talk about constitutional issues in relation to Scotland. It's allowing us not to talk about the utter destruction of our welfare systems. And you don't have to be that cynical to kind of think, it does really function as a bit of a distraction. You perhaps have to be more cynical than me to think that somebody invented it for that purpose. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
There's a lot of rhetoric that comes out of, the Remainers, or the Remoaners as they're called, and the Brexiteers, and different factions of different political parties, and it gets extremely frustrating, sort of waking up one day and thinking you believe one version of the world and then everything can change the next. But what I will say is that we, so far, as a union, we have been quietly encouraged by the engagement we have had from the UK government, and I won't list everybody that we are speaking to, but our access has been good, and they are giving a fair hearing to what we have to say. How that will translate into the future agriculture bill and the final Brexit deal that we end up with, I can't say yet, because it's our job, I suppose, to be effective and to ensure that it is written there in statute. The issue about the hill farming payments, which you mentioned, I think you're referring to the cap convergence issue, which is a hugely technical issue that I won't bore you all with just now, but essentially it was an uplift of funding that was delivered to the UK from the European Commission as a result of Scotland having, on average, a lower payment rate per hectare because of the fact that we are disadvantaged in our landscapes. And the decision was taken by the XXX, I think, DEFRA Secretary, Owen Patterson, to split that money equally across the UK, where we'd argued very strongly that money should be delivered in full to Scotland because it's only because of the fact that we are disadvantaged that we had this money. Anyway, we were promised a review of that decision in 2016, but then of course we had a surprise Brexit vote, and then we had a surprise general election, and I think the UK government got a surprise when the general election didn't turn out the way they would have hoped. So it kind of got kicked into the long grass. Anyway, we most recently met with the DEFRA Secretary in December and did receive warm words about the potential findings from the review which is now taking place, and we just have to take at face value what we're being told. Our role is to continue to engage and to press our arguments. So I hope it's not too much of a fudge of a question. I can't say whether or not I trust yet, but obviously the proof will be in the pudding. What we're looking ahead to next is the publication of, well, it was called a white paper, now it's being called a command paper. I don't really know what the difference is, but a command paper on a future bill on agriculture. We have been told by DEFRA that there will be significant latitude within that to ensure that Scotland will have a budget and the policy tools to do what we want and need for Scottish agriculture, and that is reassuring to hear. But until we have that on paper, we can't take that for granted. So that's what we're focusing on just now, is ensuring that the convergence review is completed in a timely manner and that money delivered back to Scotland, and that the future agriculture bill for future policy moving forward is fitting to our needs. So we're continuing to have these discussions. I'll be back in London on Thursday, banging the drum again.
In their cosy slippers. Yeah, I mean, the acreage was what CAP was, the single payment system was structured around. It is no longer. You probably know more about it in detail than I will, so I won't say too much more about that. But absolutely, most decent farmers, and I know some, are just appalled by how the single payment system was handled and how it has made all farmers look like grabbing, thieving, self-interested idiots. Because the truth is that actually most kind of moderately sized farms need the subsidy. Because if they don't get the subsidy, we pay, £50 for a loaf of bread, or £20 for a bag of sprouts or whatever. So the food has to be subsidised some way or another, and the way that it is subsidised is by paying the farmers a decent rate for their production. And Clare's graph earlier on made it very clear that it's actually not that easy to make money in some areas of farming. Sheep farming, if you go back to the 12th century, sheep farming was the thing to be in. Cooper Angus Abbey was once the richest abbey in Scotland, and it was the richest abbey in Scotland because it had laid claim to vast areas of Glen Isla and Glen Shee, and they kept thousands of sheep, and they went. And interestingly, we're in the process of kind of extricating ourselves from Europe. The big market in wool, it was wool particularly, was in Antwerp. So, we were in Europe in the 12th, 13th centuries, and killing it with our wool. Now, it's not worth clipping a sheep. You can't pay somebody to clip a sheep because you can't sell the wool. The only people who are harvesting wool at the moment are people who are kind of doing like specialist stuff, specialist wools, and they then have to sell their handcrafted product at prices that you're not going to pay in Primark or that kind of thing. So the world, the markets, they're all a bit mad in my view. I think I've kind of gone a bit off track from your question. Do you know what I mean?
I think my understanding is that percentage-wise, a huge amount of the subsidy goes to a very few people.
Yes. Yeah. I think something like the first 100 people get more than the next, all the rest put together. It is ludicrous. Well, at least that's how it was. It's supposed to be improving. You perhaps know more of the detail. Yeah. The prospect for it improving is there. A lot of this depends on who's running the show. And if big farmers and their friends and landowners and their friends are your MP, they're probably going to make decisions that are not necessarily good for small farmers.
Just on the point about area-based support, you're quite right. It used to be, it's gone through various different reforms in the 40 years it's been within the EU, but the most recent reform essentially moved us over to a system of what they call area-based support, but it's essentially classified on land types. So in Scotland, we have 3 regions, we call them, that are sort of 3 types and classifications of land. So for the best land, you get the highest payment, and then it kind of goes down a sliding scale like that. But as I outlined in the presentation, we have limited areas of that kind of top grade land, which means that a lot more of the payments are going out to kind of smaller parcels, if that makes sense, that aren't of such a high quality. So the question that you raised about a large proportion of the funding going to a very small number of people, that might have been the case a lot more in the past, but it's, it certainly is an issue. I think in England, where they have a different way of distributing the funds, but in Scotland it's not so much of an issue because we do have them, but we have less of the very, very large scale, big commercial units, and a lot of the smaller scale sort of family run units as well. But the system is not perfect, and the slipper farmers issue, I have a very unfortunate surname working in this industry. It's bad anyway, this is essentially your landowners who will do the very, very, what I should have said is that you qualify for a payment by if you basically meet a minimum stocking density, so you have to prove that you have some agricultural activity on that land. You can't just sit on a vast estate and do absolutely nothing and withdraw down huge amounts of public support, but people have found ways around it. And one thing that I will say is that the activity requirement, without going into huge technical detail here, but the activity requirement is something which we've always been very, very keen to nail here in Scotland, so that we can make sure slipper farmers don't take all the cash where there's others who genuinely need it, where they miss out. But it's been very difficult to address in Brussels because of the sort of one-size-fits-all. It's very hard to sort of define activity and agricultural production across 28 different member states. So that is one area where we could see a vast improvement, is that we can actually now effectively, or much more effectively, target that money to make sure it's going to the areas that need it the most. So that is one potential opportunity if we get it right.
Yeah, just worth adding in that the very worst culprit of slipper farmer was based in Aberdeenshire near Bankery, Mr. Frank Smart, I think his name was. He was collecting kind of 3 million a year in subsidies. A lot of people thought that big farmers in England would be the ones who were, but it's because he basically accumulated huge amounts of land and did nothing with them. It's shocking. I think it's food and the basicness of food as a commodity would be my sort of take on that. But a couple of sort of related things that are worth saying in response to that. And one is that New Zealand was a kind of pioneer in taking out all the subsidies, and in quotes, their farming has thrived. However, they went through a lot of pain to get there. And secondly, that there are plenty of farmers here who take the view that actually we'd like to go to a non-subsidy operation and let the market kind of fight it out. One of the issues about agriculture is that there are limitations on technological innovation. For example, you can, for example, pick raspberries with a machine, but you can't then sell them as fresh fruit. You can sell them as pulp or stuff for making jam and so on, because the machine's not clever enough to kind of, and presumably that sort of thing is resolvable. Whether it's financially resolvable, financially viable, I'm not sure.
I think you hit it on the head there. Sorry, jumping
absolutely.
in. There are alternatives, and there are things that we can do in order to possibly cut costs, but it will take time, and it will cause an awful lot of pain, and probably a lot of people exiting the industry. And it's not something that we're proud of, but it's just the reality of where we are. The fact is that in Scotland and in the UK, we produce to an extremely high standard, and that is, particularly in Scotland, when you think about Scotch beef and the brand, it's internationally renowned. It's our USP, and we're proud to do that. We're happy to do that, but it comes at a cost. It means more expensive inputs. It's more time intensive, and all of that comes at a cost to the business, which means, therefore, that it's difficult to kind of farm just at market value, because you have all these other things to think about. But we don't want to sell that down the river, because the Scotch beef brand, just to use that as an example, is the one thing that we have in foreign markets, and that's one thing that will keep our industry going in the longer term, is this kind of the fantastic Scottish story behind the brand and the rolling hillsides, and and the fact that it is it's about kind of the farmer rearing the animal, and it's not about mechanisation and this sort of thing. So that's not an answer as to why there are so many costs in the industry. It's tied up in so much that we couldn't even give justice to tonight, but I think it does make the case for kind of continuing to support the industry in the short to medium term. Sorry, one final thing I will say is that, speaking with our members, none of them they don't want to be supported. They don't want to receive subsidy. All of them wish they could farm for the market and get a fair price back, but the reality is that it just doesn't return. It just won't return that. So there are some who say, let's go the New Zealand way, and those who kind of crash and burn will crash and burn, but then we'd be selling down kind of the Scottish story down the river and the family farm and all of that. So
yeah, there's one.
It's really interesting.
One tiny rider I would add on to that, which is that one of the consequences of going down a market-led road is that big guys will survive and smaller guys will go out of it. But actually, there are lots of good arguments for not having 3 or 4 enormous farms that cover the whole of Scotland instead of having more people in agriculture. It would probably push more out, actually, yeah. I think it will.
It remains to be seen. Yeah, I mean, there's huge inequalities and issues within the supply chain and sort of supermarket pricing and very unfair lack of transparency. These are issues that were ongoing before the Brexit vote and will continue to be very pertinent. So it remains to be seen.
But I mean, if there are problems getting migrant workers, for example, a lot of agricultural businesses will struggle. The Scottish, the Rural College did some research recently, and one of the things that came out of that was that some farms would reduce production and some farms would go out of business. But there are also arguments for saying making some changes to the size of farms in the other direction would be a good idea. Having more people involved in agriculture in smaller units, but making sure that they were viable would be.
One just very quick little soundbite in the interest of time. I think the second that you start to import hormone treated beef and produce that's produced to a lower standard than we have here in Scotland and in the UK is the exact same second that you export everything that we've got right off our shores, because we cannot compete with much cheaper produce coming in that's produced to a lower standard. We just can't. We're never going to compete on a sort of mass produced, stack it high, sell it low commodity market. That's not what we can do here. So we have to fight as a union and as an industry extremely strongly to ensure that we don't sort of dial down or deharmonise on our very high standards. It's very, very important.
And as a country, we have to fight as a country.
Yes. I would say a well, I'm here to represent our membership, so I paraphrase, or I hope I'm not putting words into their mouths, but I think it would go back to this activity-based system. So it's public support for delivering a public good, and that is by agricultural activity. I think we really, really need to get that sorted out. So it's not just wasting money on hillsides that have nothing happening on it. It's got to be targeted agricultural activity. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
On the point about regulatory divergence or harmonisation, I think we've just got to hope that common sense prevails. I think it's clear. I think it's clear that the EU trade deal will be the priority, and regulatory harmonisation is completely part and parcel of that. It was interesting. I was in Brussels last week, and we met with the Canadian mission, who have representation out in Brussels, and talking about the recent CETA arrangement and just kind of comparing notes about how they found that process. And quite frighteningly, it took them over 10 years to negotiate this trade deal with the EU, and we're trying to cram it into the space of a few months. But anyway, but they presented us with various different stacks of paper that's basically on this issue of regulatory equivalence, which is all that we're banging on about. We've got to have equivalence, we've got to ensure kind of similar production standards. And kind of had one big stack of paper on this side and then another stack of paper on this side. And it's basically, this is on an issue where the two systems in Canada and the EU are very, very similar, but it took that much paper and 7 years for them to work through every single line on this one particular, I think it was something to do with, it was a veterinary issue crossing borders. And you just think that is just one, well, I'm sure it's a big issue, but one seemingly tiny issue in a very big trade deal, and it took 7 years and that much paper, and so it's quite humbling. But I suppose in some ways the UK is starting from a different point as Canada, because we have harmony with the EU at the moment in terms of our standards. So I hope that a lot of that will just go through like tick tick tick. They are equivalent, but I'm not sat in the negotiating room, so I don't know how this discussion's going.
Some people think that Brexit's not going to happen. I think it probably will, but my best guess of the moment is that it will happen. The ones who haven't woken up already will wake up, and it will be reversed. That's my take on it.